Of. The morning Isadora Blythe was handed off to a stranger, the sky was the color of a bruise. She remembered that detail later. The way the clouds sat low and purple over the Kansas plains, pressing down like they had somewhere better to be and couldn't be bothered to move. She was 22 years old, standing in the yard of her father's failing farm with a single carpetbag at her feet, watching a man she had never seen before climb down from a wagon that had seen better decades. His name was Cormac Yates. That was all her father told her. His name is Cormac Yates. He's agreed to take you. Don't make trouble. Don't make trouble. As if she were a loose board to be nailed down. As if the whole arrangement, her life, her future, the years stretching out ahead of her, were simply a matter of convenience to be settled before supper. Isadora had grown up knowing her father loved the farm more than he loved her. That was fine. The farm had never asked him for anything he couldn't give. She had made the mistake, at various points in her childhood, of needing things. A new pair of boots, a school primer, once, memorably, a doctor when she'd broken 2 fingers in the barn door. Each time her father had looked at her with that particular expression she'd come to recognize, the one that said, "You are an expense I did not budget for." When the bank threatened to take the land, she understood immediately what kind of currency she had become. Cormac Yates did not look at her the way most men looked at women who'd been bartered. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, no ownership, no particular interest of any kind. He looked at her the way a man looks at weather, noting it, accounting for it, moving on. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed. Broad through the shoulders. His coat was worn at the elbows, and his boots were caked with dried mud that might have been there since the previous winter. His jaw was dark with several days of beard. He had the hands of someone who worked, genuinely worked, the knuckles rough and the palms calloused in specific places that came from holding reins and axes and nothing softer. He nodded at her bag. "Is that all?" "Yes," she said. He picked it up, put it in the wagon, and climbed back onto the seat. He did not help her up. She climbed up herself, settled her skirt, and stared straight ahead at the horse's ears while her father watched from the porch without waving. They drove north. She did not ask where they were going. Partly because she was afraid of the answer, and partly because Cormac Yates did not seem like a man who answered questions, unless he had decided independently that the question deserved one. He drove in silence. The plains rolled out on either side of the road, brown and flat and enormous, the kind of landscape that made a person feel both very small and very visible, with nowhere at all to hide. After an hour, she asked anyway. How far?" 2 days, he said. 2 days. She pressed her hands together in her lap and looked at the horizon and did not cry, because crying would have required believing this was happening to her personally, and she found it easier at that particular moment to feel as though it were happening to someone else entirely. The first night they stopped at a way station, a rough building with a fireplace and a plank floor where travelers could sleep for the price of a coin. Cormac paid for 2 separate corners without being asked to. He gave her his bedroll and slept on the bare boards himself. She watched him do it without comment and lay awake for a long time in the dark, listening to the wind press against the walls and trying to understand what kind of man she had been given to. Not a cruel one, she thought. Not yet, but not a kind one either. Just a man shaped around his own purposes, closed as a fist, moving through the world without explaining himself to it. The second day was harder than the first. The road climbed into rougher country, scrub cedar and red rock, the sky wider and emptier than any sky she'd seen. The wagon rattled. Her back ached. She ate the biscuits he handed her at midday without tasting them, and watched the land change from flat to broken, from brown to something darker, more serious, as if the earth itself were getting ready to say something it had been holding back. Late in the afternoon, she asked, "What's it like? Where we're going?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Cold in winter." She waited. "There's a cabin," he said. "Wood, 1 room, spring is about a mile off. Good water, 1 room," she absorbed that. 1 room, and the kind of man who described his home in the fewest possible words, as if anything more might cost him something. "What do you do?" she asked. "For work." "What needs doing?" he said. That was the end of the conversation. The cabin appeared around a bend in the track just as the sun dropped behind the ridge. It was, as draft, made of wood. It was small. The roof had been repaired in at least two places that she could see, the newer logs pale against the weathered ones. There was a covered porch with a single chair on it, a woodpile stacked high along the east wall, a lean-to for the horses, a kitchen garden gone to late-season stubble. Behind the cabin, the land rose steeply into cedar and rock, dark and close. She climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard and looked at it. This was her life now. Cormac unhitched the horses without looking at her. She carried her own bag inside. The cabin was clean, which surprised her. Not comfortable. There was nothing on the walls, no curtains, no softness of any kind, but clean. The floor was swept. The iron stove in the corner was free of rust. The single bed was made up with a wool blanket, military tight. Beside it, a narrow cot had been pushed against the far wall, clearly added recently, the wood still pale. He slept on the cot. He did not tell her this. She simply found, at the end of that first night, that he had laid himself down on it without discussion, facing the wall, and was asleep within minutes, as if the matter had already been decided somewhere she hadn't been present for. She lay in the actual bed and stared at the ceiling and thought, he doesn't want this either. It was not a comforting thought, exactly, but it was something. It was more than she'd had that morning. The weeks that followed were the strangest of her life, not because they were dramatic, but because they were so relentlessly ordinary. She woke early, she made the fire. She cooked what there was to cook, salt pork, cornmeal, dried beans, the occasional rabbit he brought in, and she tried to make it taste like something. He came and went. He worked from first light until dark, always outside, always moving, and he never told her what he was doing, and she never saw the results of it, which began quietly to bother her. What was he doing up there in those hills? She was practical enough not to ask at first. She had made a study in her short life of men who didn't want to be asked things, her father chief among them, and she had learned that asking too soon only made them close tighter. So she watched instead. She paid attention to small things, the way he cleaned his hands before supper, always, scrubbing them longer than the actual dirt required. The way he read by the stove in the evenings, real books, not almanacs, not farm ledgers, but actual books with cracked spines that he handled with something close to care. The way he sometimes stopped in the middle of eating and looked at nothing, his face very still, like a man doing mathematics in his head. He was thinking about something, always, and whatever it was, it lived entirely behind his eyes, where she could not reach it. One morning in November, she followed him. She was not proud of it. She told herself she was checking on the spring, which was true in the way that things are technically true when you have decided in advance to do something and are looking for a reason that doesn't sound like what it actually is. She took the bucket and walked in the same direction she'd seen him go, and she did go to the spring, and she did fill the bucket, and then instead of turning back, she kept walking. The trail climbed for nearly a mile, switchbacking up the ridge through cedar and loose shale. She was breathing hard by the time she came around a boulder and stopped dead. There was a man below her, in the flat below the ridge's far side, working on a fence line. She knew it was Cormac before she could see his face. She'd memorized the shape of him by then, the particular set of his shoulders, the economy of his movements. But it wasn't the man who stopped her. It was what was behind him. She stood very still and looked for a long time. Then she turned around and went back down the trail without refilling the bucket, and she made supper in silence, and she did not say a word about what she had seen, and she spent the evening sitting by the stove pretending to mend a hem she had finished 3 days ago, thinking about everything she thought she understood and everything she clearly did not. That night she heard him set the book down, heard him cross the floor, not to the cot, but to her side of the cabin. She kept her eyes on the mending. "His shat up the ridge today," he said. It wasn't a question. "I went to the spring," she said. A pause, and after, she looked up then. His face was the same as always, still, unreadable, doing that interior mathematics. But there was something underneath it that she hadn't seen before. Not anger. Not exactly. Something more like waiting. "What is that?" she asked. "Out there." He was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down across from her, elbows on his knees, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked like a man who was tired of carrying something alone. It's mine, he said. How much of it? He told her. She put the mending down. She had grown up poor in the particular way that people who have always been poor are poor. Not dramatically, not tragically, but quietly and thoroughly, like water damage that starts in the walls and spreads until the whole structure is compromised. She knew what land was worth. She knew what cattle were worth. She could calculate roughly what she was sitting across from, and the number her mind arrived at was large enough that she sat with it for a moment before speaking. Why, she said. He looked at her. Why are you living like this? Why she gestured at the bare walls, the single chair, the battered pots on their hooks. Why any of this? He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it moving through the cedar on the ridge, a sound like breathing. I was married before, he said finally. 7 years ago. She knew what I had before she agreed. She left after the first winter. He paused. She said the land was worth more than the life on it. Isadora said nothing. I decided, he said, that the next time I would know first. She understood then. Not all of it. She suspected there were years of it she would never fully understand, but enough. Enough to see the shape of what had happened. A man who had been chosen for his assets and abandoned for his inconveniences, who had rebuilt himself around the question of what was real. She had been, she realized, a test she hadn't known she was taking. The strange thing was that she wasn't angry. She wanted to be. She thought she probably had the right to be. But sitting across from him in the lamplight, watching him look at the floor with the expression of a man who had just said more than he'd said, in months she found that the anger wouldn't quite come. You could have told me, she said. I know, he said. You should have told me. I know that too. She picked up the mending and looked at it without seeing it. The fire settled in the stove. The wind moved through the ridge. What do you want? She asked. From me, actually. He looked at her for a long moment. I don't want you to stay because of what you saw today, he said. If you want to leave, I'll take you to town in the morning. I'll give you enough to start somewhere. No conditions. That's not what I asked. Another pause, the longest one yet. She was beginning to understand that his silences were not absence. They were the opposite of absence. They were where he kept the things he wasn't sure how to say. I want a partner, he said at last. Someone who stays through the hard parts, not because they have to. She thought about her father's farm, about the way the word home had never quite fit in her mouth when she said it in relation to that place. About the morning she'd stood in the yard with her single bag and the bruised sky overhead and felt, underneath the fear, something else. Something almost like relief that she was leaving, that something was finally going to change. Even if the change was terrible. She thought about the shape of this man, the books with their cracked spines, the cot he'd slept on for weeks without being asked, the hands scrubbed clean before every meal. The way he drove 2 days through the plains without once asking her to be anything other than what she was, quiet and afraid and trying not to show it. She thought about what she'd seen from the ridge. Not the land, or not only the land, the way he'd been working on that fence, alone in the cold, methodical and unhurried. A man building something that was going to outlast him, whether anyone was there to see it or not. I'm not leaving, she said. He looked at her. Not tonight, she added. Not because of what I saw, because, she paused and tried to find an honest way to say it. I think you're a strange man, Cormac Yates. I think you have made things very difficult for both of us for reasons that made sense to you and that I partly understand and partly don't. I think you have more to say than you have said. She met his eyes. And I think I'd like to hear it eventually, when you're ready. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, and she would remember this later, the specific quality of it, the way it changed the whole landscape of his face. He almost smiled. Not quite, the edges of it maybe, the suggestion, but she saw it, and she filed it away like a deed to something, proof that the thing existed, even if she didn't have full possession of it yet. Winter came down hard off the ridge that year, the kind of cold that moves into a building and stays, settling into the walls like a tenant. She learned things, how to bank the stove so it held through the night, where he kept the extra lamp oil behind the left flour bin, not the right, that he slept badly when the wind was from the north, that he woke before she did and always had coffee made, that he said nothing to her in the mornings for a full half hour, but it was a comfortable nothing, a nothing that had stopped being silence and started being something else she didn't quite have a word for yet. She learned other things too, that the land on the far side of the ridge was not only large but carefully managed, that what she'd seen was a fraction of it, the visible edge of something that ran for miles, that he knew every acre of it personally on foot, the way a man knows a thing he has built himself rather than inherited, that there were 3 other men who worked it with him, who appeared every few weeks and disappeared again, and who greeted her with the careful politeness of men who had been briefed to treat her well. She learned that he could fix nearly anything mechanical, that he had a particular hatred of dishonesty in small things more than large ones, the way some people are more bothered by a small lie than by a catastrophe, that he had a brother somewhere in Colorado he did not speak of, that he had once, before any of this, worked a season on the railroad and had decided after 3 months that he would rather be poor and above ground than employed and underground. He was not rich in the way she'd imagined rich people were. He didn't seem to think much about the money, the same way a person who has always had enough to eat doesn't think much about food. The ranch was not an achievement to him. It was simply the thing he was responsible for, the way some people are responsible for a family or a vocation. He took it seriously in the way he took most things, quietly, thoroughly, without needing anyone to notice. Not the whole of it, not at first, but in pieces over the long winter evenings. He listened the way he did most things, without interrupting, without offering immediate consolation or judgment. Sometimes he asked a question, a small one, precise, that revealed he'd been paying attention to things she hadn't known she'd said. Once in February she was in the middle of telling him about something. The winter she'd been 11, the broken fingers, the way her father had looked at the doctor's bill, and she noticed she was crying. Not dramatically, just the quiet kind, the kind that comes from unexpected directions when you're not guarding against it. She stopped talking and pressed her fingers to her eyes and felt embarrassed about it. "Sorry," she said. "Don't apologize," he said. It was simply said. Not with warmth exactly. He was still not a warm man, not in the way people meant when they said warm, but with a kind of steadiness that was something better, she thought. Warmth could be performed. Whatever he was offering was not a performance. By spring, she had stopped thinking about it as the cabin. She had started thinking of it quietly, without making much of it, as home. The morning the snow began to melt in earnest, she woke to find him standing on the porch, looking out at the ridge. She brought 2 cups of coffee and stood beside him. They were quiet for a while, which was a different quiet now, fuller, like a room that's been lived in long enough to hold the shape of the people in it. "I want to show you something," he said. They rode up and over the ridge and down the far side, and she saw it in daylight for the first time, properly, without the urgency of a discovered secret. The full sweep of it, the pasture land running gold and brown in the early spring light, the cattle moving slow and small in the distance, the creek winding through the low places, the house, the real house, sitting on a gentle rise a half-mile from the ridge base. 2 stories, sandstone and timber, solid as a fact. She looked at it for a long time. "You built that?" she said. "Most of it. How long?" 8 years. 8 years. She thought about what it meant to spend 8 years building something this real, this carefully. Alone. She thought about the first wife, the one who'd left. She thought about what it cost a person to start again after something like that, to decide the thing was worth doing, even without the guarantee of anyone to share it with. "Can I see inside?" she said. He looked at her. Then he climbed down from his horse and offered her his hand. Not out of formality, she could tell the difference by now, and she took it, and they walked up the path to the front door together. The inside was almost entirely empty. A few pieces of furniture, draped in cloth, a fireplace large enough to stand in. Windows on every side, the spring light coming through clean and new. It smelled of cedar and stone and something she couldn't name. Time, maybe. The specific smell of a place that has been waiting. "I didn't furnish it," he said. "I didn't know what someone else might want." She walked through the room slowly. Kitchen, parlor, stairs, bedrooms, each one bare and full of light and possibility. He followed at a slight distance, giving her space the way he had from the beginning, she realized. Always one deliberate step back, waiting to see what she'd do with the room she'd been given. She stood at the window of what might be a sitting room, south-facing, the light warm and steady, and looked out at the land running away to the horizon. "Isadora," he said. She turned. He was standing in the doorway. He had his hat in his hands, which she'd never seen before. He was always either wearing it or setting it on the hook by the door. Never this slightly awkward holding of it, this minor uncertainty that she recognized as more than minor. "I know this isn't what you agreed to," he said. "When your father—" He stopped. Started again. "You didn't have a choice then. I want you to have one now." She looked at him across the empty room. "You can have the deed to the south parcel," he said, "in your name. It's worth enough to start anywhere you want. No argument, no conditions. If you want to go, I will help you go." She was quiet. "Or," he said, and paused, and she watched the effort it cost him, not because he doubted it, but because saying things like this had always cost him more than most people. "You can stay. Help me figure out what to put in these rooms." The south-facing light lay across the floor between them. She had been given away by her father like something he was done with. She had ridden 2 days across the plains to a cabin with bare walls, and a man who spoke in the fewest possible words. She had followed him up a ridge in November to understand what was secret about him, and she had understood, and the thing she'd understood had turned out to be not a deception but a grief. A man who had learned the hard way what it meant to be wanted for the wrong things, and had quietly rebuilt himself around the determination not to let that happen again. She thought about the cot he'd slept on for weeks, the books, the coffee every morning before she was awake, the way he'd said don't apologize in February, with that steadiness, that absence of performance. She thought about 8 years of building something alone. She crossed the room, she stopped in front of him and looked up at him, and he looked back at her with the specific expression she'd come to know. Still, waiting, the interior mathematics happening somewhere behind his eyes. She reached out and took the hat from his hands and set it on the windowsill. "I'll need a proper stove in the kitchen," she said. "And curtains. Not the cheap kind." Something moved across his face, the same thing she'd seen that night by the lamplight. The edge of something that was almost a smile but quieter, more private, like a thing he was keeping between himself and the wall before he decided it was safe to let it be seen. "Whatever you want," he said. And that was how Isadora Blythe, who had left her father's failing farm with one carpetbag and a bruised sky overhead, came to find herself standing in a house full of light, in a life she hadn't been able to imagine the morning it began, choosing for the first time with both hands exactly where she wanted to be.